All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Taylor D. Mason. I use they and them pronouns. I am the writer, director, producer, and co editor of Grist. Grist is a short film about an aspiring musician who really finds solace in a community of underground healers in the aftermath of trauma and taps into a little bit of her own feelings about justice and healing herself or themselves.
I wanted to ask you about the title because grist,
Mhm.
at least as I've encountered the word, has to do with grinding.
Mhm.
Uh, Tell me about that choice of word for the title.
Yes. I remember when we were looking for titles, I was looking for titles for the film, and there was something about the word for me phonetically that I love because of the texture of it itself, like the grittiness of the sound of the word. But then in
Hmm.
looking into it further and the way that the community, the Tulsi House community, is really taking each of their experiences of trauma, of isolation, just of queerness and what they've been through, and utilizing that and turning it on its head to become their strengths, their powers, their skill sets, their magic in a lot of ways. It to me reminded me of how we talk about grist in terms of like a wheat that you grind down for another purpose. It's these
Right.
experiences that we grind down and then kind of alchemize into something else.
Well, it struck me as working both ways within your short film, in that
Mhm.
there's the alchemy of the healing that Ryan
Mhm.
goes in for, but prior to that, you can see how this trauma is grinding them down.
Mm.
Um, and that so the title struck me as being, having more than one meaning, I guess.
Definitely, definitely.
When Ryan first goes into the office, they
Mhm.
seem really ill at ease with the group, in the waiting room.
Yeah.
um, and in Ryan's head, what is that all about?
So for Ryan, their friend Mel, who comes out onto the fire escape to come get them, Mel is the only person who really knows the extent of what Ryan has been through and dealt with. So for them to open up and to allow themselves to be vulnerable enough to say something is wrong and I want to seek support. And I want to seek support not just from like a therapist or someone like that, but someone in community, someone that is like very word of mouth, kind of secret in a lot of ways, very intentionally. It's a different type of vulnerability. And for them to be in a space and finally see other aspects of themselves reflected and realize that this is genuinely a safe space is when you see that little bit of opening up. And then once they get into the room with Jean and have a little bit more of a conversation, it's slowly those walls begin to come down a bit.
I The line that jumped out at me was, "Who were you before fear touched you?" And I
Mm-hmm.
know we're talking about a character in a specific setting with a specific set of traumas, but that just struck me as universal. And I'm just going to be honest, Taylor. I had no answer. I have no memory
Mm-hmm.
of a time before fear. Um, so that line really resonated.
It's I've heard that a few times from a few people, and it's interesting because the society that we live in is very rooted in that. All the phobias that we have that are socially based come from their fear of what we don't know and who we feel might be some sort of danger to us or our values. So it can be a very universal feeling.
Yeah, yeah. As I was saying, I want to approach the subject of trauma respectfully,
Hmm.
both with you and for those who are listening.
Hmm.
Um, but can you talk a little bit about the Trey Ryan relationship? At this point, I should say
Hmm.
the audience has seen your film,
Okay.
so we don't have to worry about spoilers.
Yes. Okay. In terms of their relationship, Trey is a cousin that Ryan grew up with, and she alludes to this or says it explicitly when they're in the room with John. But he would always attempt a couple things or just say little offhanded comments that weren't okay. And once Ryan really began to step into their identity, their sexuality, it became a very distinctly unsafe environment for them. and that is where certain harms took place. The film intentionally doesn't name the nature of all the harms. It names what it doesn't name in detail what happened, so that the audience, because I
Right.
feel like when we talk about movies that or films that go into certain types of violence, creators can have a lot of fun depicting that violence. I feel like it's essential to
Oh,
depict the details of the violence, but
I was so grateful you didn't. That
yeah.
that the camera stays there with Ryan in the present, and
Hmm.
I didn't want to see that. Yeah.
Yes. And it, for me, was really important. I got a good amount of pushback from, just like writing room groups and things like that around, well, we want to know what happened. We need to know what happened. And the answer is that we have enough images to know what happened. We have enough experiences to infer what has happened. If that is something that we're wanting to see, I would always want to interrogate why. What are we feeling like we're getting from that? That we
Yeah.
can't do our own inferral and thinking work around. Um, so intentionally stayed away from that to focus on what we don't typically see, which is the embodiment of the aftermath and the potential embodiment of what healing and like moving toward wholeness can look like, especially with other people. I feel like we get to the point of maybe seeing retribution or retaliation,
Yeah.
but not really the individual who's been harmed feeling and reaching into their own return to wholeness in the aftermath of something like this.
Well, the ending is very much what you were just describing, in that the viewer kind of has to figure out for themselves
Hmm.
why the smile, what is happening here, and I
Hmm.
think I've got to imagine that for everybody in the audience, they would have a different take on what's going on there.
Hmm. Yep. I really did. And I think in this conversation, it can be a little bit more clear where maybe my own stance is around it.
Please.
But I wanted to make it open to the audience because the truth about what we don't do when it comes to someone experiencing harm is that we don't really consult the person who has been harmed and ask them what they need and ask them what their definition of healing, of justice, of all these things is. And the sad thing is that Ryan's options are deeply limited because nothing is going to get rid of what happened to them. But they are pulled into this moment that I was hoping would pull the audience into the moment as well of knowing what I know, knowing what I have, and knowing who I have around me now. What would I do? And I have this tool with me.
Yeah.
What am I going to do with it? And Ryan's smile can be perceived as, oh, I'm going to take you down, or it can be
Hmm.
perceived as, I have everything I need and I'm good and you can't touch me. And it can change day by day depending on where someone is in their place, in their place of healing.
Well, that's the two things that John gives Ryan is,
Hmm.
something to help you sleep, which
Hmm.
is when I'm starting to spin out of control. Sleep is one of the first things that abandons me. So
Hmm.
you're not going to make healthy decisions without that. But
Hmm.
then the talisman, you get to use it once, right?
Hmm. You can use it once in the way that John names it. So it's called an apposite. It's a made up crystal name, but it's rooted in the Greek word for bee. So when John says,
Mhm.
oh, Moody calls them bee stingers, it's essentially bees have their stingers with them throughout their lives, but once they use them, they're
Oh, yeah.
essentially sacrifice their lives. So it's rooted in that idea of, and this is the real struggle for a lot of people who identify as survivors, myself included, is that there are only so many options given the current system that we exist in and the current society that we
Yeah.
exist in. And when we are choosing to take things into our own hands, as specifically as queer, trans, or just LGBTQIA folks, those options are even further limited to ensure your own safety. So
Yeah.
wanted to lean into a little bit of that magical realism to get just a little bit more. But what it is that Ryan is given that choice to say, this person cannot harm me if I hold this. I know that I will never be harmed by them again. And I can thus have a protective barrier around myself and around my life that will allow me to move in a distinct way, because that is something that comes with harm, especially that's rooted in community and family, is that you essentially, oftentimes folks are forced to re-engage with it and be re-triggered and have to endure it without having the validation and the protection that they deserve. Um, and the other hand of that, the other side of that is you can go the way of saying, you're going to suffer the way that I suffered. And that is a deeply valid response to someone, for someone that has gone through harm. And in the long run, how much wholeness does that provide to us? What ends this cycle? How do we end the cycle in the absence of someone who has committed harm and actually wants to be accountable? I think that's a very important nuance to name for this, is that accountability is deeply hard for folks, and there are so many potentials for accountability and healing when someone who has caused harm is willing to be accountable. We can discuss the systems and things like that that led to their action of harm. In the aftermath of that, or in the absence of that, I should say, those options are deeply limited. I'm thinking about a lot of instances of harm right now that we're seeing in the media where people are not, you can be financially, taken care of as a form of
Right.
justice, but what is going to get you that feeling? What is going to support your nervous system to return to its sense of homeostasis? And I think when we have those limited options and are not going to police or courts or things like that to solve these problems, I wanted to get to the root of what could one possibility look like. And I kind of leaned into magical realism for that.
Part of the well, it's sort of the word you were just talking about is reparations.
Yes, yeah.
And part of that process for Ryan involves this moment in the meditation of dealing with their child self. Now that I think about it, the better question is, who heals whom in that interaction?
I would love to leave that up to people who are viewing it. And I do think that it's mutual. When I wrote it and we shot it, there's a moment where the younger version of Ryan can hear that their adult self is in distress, and then they go and they kind of like want to support them. They do support them by the end of that scene. So it can be inferred that younger Ryan is healing older Ryan. And as Ryan in their adulthood, and you'll hear me, because this is very common with folks who identify as like GNC, flip a little bit between she and they. And when we had the younger version of Ryan, it's like at that time their pronouns were she. So if there's any confusion, just let me know. As adult Ryan moves through this process, they are inevitably healing the younger part of them that eventually did experience this fear, started to experience this harm, and getting to the root and the beginning of that phase and that cycle for themselves. So it's very symbiotic for me.
Is the line when Trey wanted to punish me for being trans? That, as a trans woman, that struck deep. Is that a dynamic that is fairly common for trans folks who have been abused? Is that feeling that somebody's punishing me for this?
Yes. I want to take care around my answer because I don't identify as a trans person, and I intentionally made Ryan a gender fluid character because that is what is most an experience that I can relate to most. However, whether it's queerness, gender nonconformity, trans identity, specifically among, and I'm thinking specifically in cities, in rural places, specifically among folks of color, the immense amount of violence that is endured and experienced. I'm thinking of the number of trans women of color who've been murdered already this year.
Yeah.
There is a form and a very deep presence of power, control, and punitive treatment for expressing the fullness of one's identity. Um, and I don't know that we move through that analysis when murders happen, but it is a deeply, I do believe that whether we're talking about bullying in schools or intimate partner violence, specifically against trans women, there's a punitive and power dynamic that is taking place. Of there's only so much that I can control of who you are, and I'm going to do the most that I can for the parts against the parts that I can't control, and that often ends in violent harm.